So I'm new to working on large donor-funded projects, and much of what I'm grappling with around neoliberalism, what it means, how it affects the work of feminist researchers and NGO activists with marginalized women has to do with work that I've begun fairly recently with IT for Change, Anita specifically, on involving marginalized women in public participation and local governance through using ICTs. So my discussion stems from patterns that I've been observing, but I'm still battling to analyze and theorize about. So at present, my ideas, as I say, are very impressionistic and general. By way of framing my main argument and observations, though, I want to invoke Partha Chatterjee's discussion of the role of NGOs in post-colonial contexts. Simply put, and I'm really reducing his argument is that civil society in the present has become an elite enclave. With a growing trend towards rights-based politics, marginalized groups are increasingly defined as target populations, docile bodies, whose lives and stories are interpreted in ways that allow them to become the beneficiaries of developmentalism, rights discourses, and governmentality. Chatterjee's comments have been criticized for their generality, rightly so, I think. But I still find them very suggestive in thinking about power relations in civil society activism in South Africa's present, and also in hopefully in other post-colonial contexts. So hopefully this will generate some kind of comparative discussion. The complexity and intricacies of social struggles and agencies are in many ways managed, made real, turned into manageable scripts by NGOs, CBOs, and even within social movements. I think there's often a sort of romanticizing of social movements. I think many of you know the Treatment Action Campaign in South Africa. There were very, very complex power dynamics within that ostensibly people-driven social movement of AIDS activism. So in many ways, as I say, that the lives, the struggles, which are very messy and complex of marginalized groups are somehow tamed. And NGOs, progressive researchers, and feminist academics, such as myself, are becoming increasingly somehow disconnected from the everyday struggles, the complex struggles of marginalized women especially, and end up translating and often flattening the complex and messy experiences of subaltern women, which are also often very ambiguous. And I think Anita made this point on the panel earlier on. I don't think that Chatterjee's critique or criticisms of this have taken into account the massive impact of ICTs in influencing tricky patterns of representation, translation, mediation, appropriation, and of course silencing that Chatterjee's critique raises. But of course ICTs, especially when we consider the digital divide, patterns of access and control of ICT resources, obviously involve very tricky patterns of silencing, representation, and appropriation. The complexity and intricacies of social struggles and agencies are in many ways managed, as I said before, as manageable scripts. So Chatterjee's argument, however overgeneralized, is a useful point of departure for thinking critically about the ambiguities of what exactly it means when NGOs, academics, policy researchers, often very radical and with the best of intentions, what it is they do when they seek to use ICTs to enhance the voices of socially marginalized groups, especially women. I want to raise some problems and questions around this with reference to one organization specifically and a set of processes foregrounding what seems to be a very rich and adventurous use of ICTs for facilitating women's voices in the public sphere, making women's voices heard. The organization that I want to talk about is an organization called SWET. It's an NGO in South Africa focusing on the rights and agencies of sex workers, both South African sex workers and immigrants. And of course, this is a particularly vulnerable and marginalized group, vulnerable to violence, vulnerable to poverty, gender discrimination, racial discrimination, and often xenophobia, because very often these are immigrant women. Recently, SWET has become increasingly effective and visible. It's also been very proactive in using ICTs for its activism and advocacy, with many role players coming together to support this. A workshop focusing on one of SWET's recent projects I attended last year highlighted this. various progressive academics, both South African and from beyond, sex workers, artists, photographers, and NGOs came together in Johannesburg to discuss the products of a recent donor-funded project called Reclaiming Dignity. Photo voice methodology combining text and photographs worked together to help insert the voices and experiences of sex workers as an extremely marginalized group into the public domain. The aim was to encourage sex workers to tell their own stories through text and especially photographs, and then to use both new and traditional media to publicize and exhibit these. The idea was also then to ensure the circulation of these stories, both in communities, so there were many exhibitions in Gauteng, in townships, in poor areas, and in the city centers, and also, of course, to circulate these exhibitions via the internet. For me, though, so everything seemed to be really very progressive, this kind of combination of role players, ranging from sex workers to academics, the circulation in the public sphere, in the sort of real sense of their stories. But the dynamic at the workshop and what I followed afterwards raised the problems of appropriation and reduction that Pathagy alludes to. First, the training of the sex workers by the writers and photographers who were involved in the workshop was extremely rushed. Ultimately, the Photo Voice project focused less on how they politicized and dealt with the messiness and complexity of the experiences than on the product. So there was this fixation with getting the product together, which needed to be completed at a particular time, of course, to meet donor requirements. Second, the position of the artists, academics, and NGO workers. Although there was a great deal of very enthusiastic, passionate, and politically engaged interest in using new methodologies, seemed to be very absolutely concerned with ensuring that everything was ready to be put onto the internet, to be publicized, to meet with donor requirements. And very often there was a tendency to compromise the politics that they started off with because of the need to deliver. And of course, as one of the academics who was part of this process, albeit in a sort of incidental way, I was asked to comment. I also ended up reinforcing reinforcing the way the project involved. So, acknowledging that although more could be done, for example, to encourage the sex workers' autobiographical voices or ensure some kind of follow-up, the exhibition was very powerful. Thirdly, and I think this is a particularly complex area, the sex workers themselves. About 5 of the sex workers attended the workshop in Johannesburg, although many more were involved in the actual project. Many more were started off with the training. Those who attended the workshop had successfully gone through the training process. And I was expecting them to be more outspoken about the complexities of the process and to speak for those who hadn't been able to complete it for various reasons. In other words, to speak for the collective and raise the difficulties of the process. Many participants didn't complete the process for various reasons. Some of these had to do with how the violent realities of certain participants' lives intruded and prevented them from completing the course. Some had to do with how the emotional and psychological, the process that were raised, just somehow couldn't be accommodated within the project. So obviously the whole process of writing your life for a sex worker who's never really had time to reflect on this is hugely traumatic, and the project simply didn't make provision for this, and many sex workers just were overwhelmed and dropped out. So those were some of the problems. Yet the participants who attended were all very kind of formulaic about what they had gained from the project, in many ways speaking the kind of formulaic language of developmentalism. Very positively they spoke about becoming visible, having been empowered, having acquired a voice in the public sphere. And I also learned, interestingly, that these participants would have the opportunity to participate more centrally in the second round of the project. So what does all this suggest in thinking about how power is being played out in civil society activism involving academics and NGOs as partners? And I'm certainly not going to come up with a nice, neat conclusion by any means here. But I think it's important to preface any conclusions by stressing that what often motivates social actors is often very complex and ambiguous situational strategizing, rather than acting to secure interests in a logical and systematic way. So it's possible to return to Chatterjee's critiques of what civil society activism really means, not by identifying clear-cut class interests, but by thinking about how groups such as progressive academics, NGO workers, policy researchers, and the obviously marginalized groups within organizations negotiate very complex patron-client relationships in terms of processes like, for example, accessing resources and opportunities from government departments or donors. So some of the questions that surface for me then are, I'm not sure how much time I have. Okay. Some of the questions that surface for me are which groups and individuals come to constitute the elite, what Pathergy calls the elite, that manages and translates the incompleteness of marginalized groups' struggles. At times it would seem that many individuals within these marginalized groups, such as the sex workers who participated in the workshop, somehow come to become almost members of the elite, speaking with one voice under the impact of, and speaking very much in terms of the empowerment in conventional neoliberal terms. So the sex workers who participated successfully in the workshop were obviously empowered in highly individualistic terms, and somehow developed aspirations for further empowerment, almost as clients within this donor-funded project. I think a second question for me is, how does the emphasis on human rights claims in current civil society activism shut down on broader forms of protest and struggle? And how do these human rights claims flatten and obscure struggles that take the intersectionality of human experiences into account? So, as I said before, many sex workers are illegal immigrants. They're poor, they're black. Yet often the rights claims revolve only around one aspect of their multiple identities. And in South Africa, the focus has been very much on the agencies, the empowerment of sex workers. So very often sex workers who have been sort of politicized within the organization's sweat will come into public forums and talk about the need for people to recognize the agency, without actually struggling with the extent to which that agency is severely constrained. So without grappling with feminist politics. And that seems to be very much the way that very often civil society activism is evolving, certainly in South Africa in the present day, in terms of human rights claims. Thirdly, for the progressive and radical academics, NGO activists, researchers who work on civil society activism, what are the challenges of being led by the voices of marginalized groups? And somebody spoke about that before. It's a huge thing, but I keep on returning to it. I think about, it's in many ways of something very naive, but it's something that I feel more and more the need to do, especially having worked on this project with young women in South Africa. What does it mean when we act as translators, often by using very powerful and influential ICTs to convey the lives and voices of marginalized groups to an international community? And how can we surface these dilemmas that we grapple with all the time and be more self-reflexive about them without feeling that we're attacking each other, that we threatening anything, and just without feeling paralyzed. And I'll stop there.